Our first panel is going to get underway right on time. I'm so pleased. And I want to introduce our moderator, who is Professor Saidiya Hartman, a much esteemed and beloved colleague at Columbia, professor of English and comparative literature. And I have to mention two things. One is that we have one of her books out on the table for sale, Lose Your Mother. And more importantly, I mean, that's really important, but also in just about 3.5 weeks, we are having a book salon celebrating her newest book, which is going to be published about the day before the event happens. So you can be the first on your block to get this book by coming to the book salon, which is happening in this room, I believe on March 4th in the evening. And it's in our newsletter that you probably got with your program. So just have a look for that, because it's going to be a really wonderful event. We have a star-studded lineup of people who will have read the book and talking with Saidiya about it. So it's really exciting, and I'm very happy. And Saidiya is going to take it away and introduce the speakers and carry us through our panel.
So it's always lovely to be here at the annual conference. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each of the speakers so we could save time for the discussion. Vaughn, Belle works in a variety of disciplines that include painting, installation, photography, video, and public interventions. And I don't know if, like most of you, I am Queen Mary is how I was introduced to your work, which is a piece of public sculpture / monument that commemorates Danish colonial amnesia while commemorating the legacies of resistance of African people who were brought to the former Danish colonies. As someone who's a descendant of those who were brought to the Dutch colonies, the histories of certain European involvement, the Danes, the Swedes, the Germans in that early period of the slave trade is often forgotten, so the work is much appreciated. Justin Leroy is the next presenter. He's an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, where he co-directs the Mellon Research Initiative on Racial Capitalism. He is the author of a forthcoming book called Freedom's Limit, Slave Emancipation and Racial Capitalism in the Long 19th Century. And then Cameron Rowland, whose work I've had the chance to see, and I actually, I think first met you in a public dialogue with the legal theorist Cheryl Harris talking about possessive investments in whiteness. And I was going to say that Cameron works across media. He says it's all sculpture, but basically his work addresses and critiques legal and economic structures that enforce, discipline, and survey contemporary life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled and honored to be on a panel like this. So I think when many of us think about the relationship of enslaved and colonized people to archives or the archive, we think about absence, lack, what isn't there, what can't be known. It goes without saying that this is a critically important path of inquiry, and pretty much all of the best scholarly work on slavery, particularly feminist scholarship on slavery in the past 2 decades or so, has explicitly wrestled with this notion of archival absence. What is or isn't in the archives exerts tremendous influence over how we narrate history. But today, rather than talking about how archives facilitate, or perhaps more often, impede the construction of historical narratives, I want to say a little bit about how the archive shapes our understanding of history as a meta-concept, and the work we imagine history does or can do. Let me begin with a vignette. In 1843, Amos Beeman, a black reverend from Connecticut, wrote to Noah Webster, as in Webster's dictionary, asking where he might find information on the history of Africa and its people. Webster replied that of the woolly-haired Africans, there is no history and can be none. Webster's insistence on the impossibility of black history is best expressed in another text from the same period, Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of History. Hegel wrote, The Negro exhibits the natural man in his completely wild and untamed state, and that Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Hegel isn't simply being racist here, and his claim is important because he's been so influential to our understanding of how history works. For Hegel, history is a kind of force whose ultimate aim is the realization of human freedom. History moves forward as humankind develops consciousness of its own potential for freedom. In other words, things get better over time, essentially. Now, even as Hegel excluded Africa and Africans from the movement of history, consider how often participants in Black freedom struggles have invoked a similar understanding of history's trajectory. One famous example might be Martin Luther King Jr.'s paraphrase of abolitionist Theodore Parker, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Given this context, I think it's clear that for Amos Beeman and for many who came after, seeking out the archives of Black history was not just about correcting factual omissions or writing more complete or accurate histories. The recovery of such histories would have a moral force and be crucial tools in the struggle for racial justice. These archives would write Black history, and in doing so, write Blackness into history, thus bringing Black people closer to freedom. The collector and bibliophile Arthur Schomburg captured this sentiment when he wrote in 1925, the American Negro must remake his past in order to make his future. History must restore what slavery has taken away." In so many ways, this is a beautiful and profound statement. And there are few figures that the field of Black history is as indebted to as it is to Schomburg. His personal collections, of course, became the basis for the Schomburg Center 15 blocks north of here. Nearly a century after Schomburg wrote these words, there's a body of work on Black history more magnificent than he probably could have imagined. Yet we can say with certainty that this work has not and cannot restored what slavery took away. When figures like Hegel or Webster cast Africa and Africans out of history, our first reaction is to say, that can't possibly be right. Just look at all of this history. Recovering the archives of Black history is supposed to disprove this foundational exclusion and render Africans and their descendants fit for the long march toward freedom. But I think it's worth dwelling on what being unfit for history means, and the things we might be able to see from a vantage point that exists outside of history, so to speak. If a philosophy of history is supposed to explain the forward progress separating past from present, if it is supposed to assure us that freedom, though yet unrealized, is forthcoming, it is an explanation and assurance that cannot bear the weight of Blackness. In other words, the perpetual movement closer to freedom, the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice, these models of history are not the only ways, or even the most useful ways, for making sense of slavery and its afterlives. Let me shift to a slightly more personal register here. I'm a historian of slavery and emancipation. I identify as an intellectual historian, meaning that I work mostly with documents produced by Black writers and thinkers. Very early on in the course of my research, I realized that slavery suffuses the archives of freedom. Free and formerly enslaved Black people insistently described the forms of freedom they experienced by using the language of slavery. Two brief examples. In 1894, in one of his last major public addresses, Frederick Douglass declared, "The Negro is physically, in certain localities, in a worse condition today than in the time of slavery. It comes of the determination of slavery to perpetuate itself, if not under one form, then under another. It is due to the folly of endeavoring to put the new wine of liberty in the old bottle of slavery." 3 decades earlier, at the height of the Civil War, one of Douglass's closest friends, the freeborn physician and abolitionist James McEwen Smith, wrote a letter to the editor of a popular Black journal in which he claimed, "There is neither in the political, nor religious, nor philanthropic worlds of the American people, any agency at work that can encompass the entire abolishment of slavery. In slave society, there is no conflict between capital and labor. Labor lies prostrate, and capital dictates its own terms, which are perpetual subjugation. In other words, perpetual slavery. So far from this war diminishing the wish or power of capital to own labor, it will increase both. Colossal monopolies are parceling out even the free states for their ownership. The slave in the South will have namesakes in fact, if not in title, north of Mason and Dixon's line. So just to parse this quotation a bit, Smith is writing at a point in the war when everyone understands that the North is no longer fighting just to restore the Union, but to abolish slavery. But despite this context and the excitement that it generated among most of his black abolitionist compatriots, he's saying, no, this war can't end slavery because capitalism itself has the ability to reproduce slavery through its domination of laboring people. At first, when I came across documents like these in the course of my research, I was unsure how to respond to them. This wasn't evidence that gave me a new understanding of historical events. It was evidence that challenged my very sense of how history itself works. How could someone like Douglass, who spent the first 2 decades of his life enslaved and a quarter century in the abolitionist movement, so casually compare the disappointments of freedom to the horrors of slavery? How could Smith interrupt the momentousness of a war being fought to end chattel slavery to interject with concerns about wage slavery? If I had approached my archive with the idea that freedom followed slavery, and no matter how truncated or limited or violent that freedom represented the first steps towards something better than slavery, I could not have made sense of these kinds of documents except as metaphor or analogy or exaggeration. And that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to take these claims seriously and wrestle with the terms that they themselves laid out, the perpetuation and expansion of slavery rather than its abatement. It meant suspending an understanding of history and historical progress that exerted such a strong pull on theorists of freedom as different as Hegel on the one hand and Martin Luther King on the other. There are 2 frameworks that have guided my reading practice and informed my relationship to the archive: the concept of the afterlife and racial capitalism. The afterlife of slavery is, at certain moments, the perpetuation of slave-like conditions after the formal end of slavery, as when Douglass remarked that in some places, freed people experienced a worse condition than in the time of slavery. But more importantly, an afterlife is the interruption of progressive historical time. Things are supposed to live and then die, and if they live again or don't quite die, it distorts our sense of proper sequence. And that sense of disruption or distortion can be valuable. The concept of an afterlife forces us to think differently and counterintuitively about the relationship between past and present, slavery and freedom. It gives us license to write history as if history moved in a multitude of ways, whether it be cyclical, static, palimpsestic, or something else altogether. Racial capitalism both marks a historical intimacy among slavery, capitalism, and empire that sometimes goes unacknowledged, but also captures the way that slavery was the epitome of a racialized system of valuation and extraction that continues to this day. Slavery inaugurated that system, yet the system survived slavery's demise. Using the language of racial capitalism to describe both what came before and what came after emphasizes historical continuities over breaks, allowing us to begin to make sense of Smith's letter during the Civil War. To make capitalism racial expands rather than particularizes our sense of what capitalism is. The term does not distinguish racial capitalism from an unmarked general capitalism, but emphasizes the ways in which capitalism is always racial, forcing us to look beyond European factories for its origins and operation. Ultimately, I want to suggest that there can be a violence to the ways that Black people are written into history, just as surely as there is a violence to the ease with which they are written out of it. But my point isn't just that things never get better or that all of Black history is just slavery. If abandoning our conviction that history progresses forward in a moral sense over time allows slavery to slip uncomfortably into the present, it also allows us to draw more fully upon the struggles of other times and places, putting them alongside our own. In other words, if we are open to other trajectories of historical movement, we might be able to better diagnose the problem of why freedom at times has looked altogether too much like slavery. But we also might find new languages to describe a more full, aspirational form of freedom. I'll end with T. Thomas Fortune, who was born enslaved in 1856 and became the editor of one of the most influential Black newspapers of the late 19th century, the New York Age. In the pages of that paper, he wrote, "We are opposed to all tyranny because we have and do now feel its blighting influence. We are with the people. Nihilism in Russia, communism in Germany and France, Irish contention in Great Britain, and abolitionism, another term for communism, in the United States. These are only synonyms for resistance by the people to the tyranny and corruption of the government, whether it be imperial, monarchical, or constitutional government." So this phrase, abolition is another term for communism, really struck me. Like James McCune Smith's statement about the Civil War being utterly unable to end slavery, Fortune's is one whose meaning is not immediately clear except as mere rhetoric if we evaluate it by the standards of progressive historical time. But viewed through the lens of racial capitalism or slavery's afterlife, then it becomes something quite different. If slavery is capitalism, then of course abolition would be communism. Allowing these histories to collide into each other, or at least being open to the possibility of such a collision, is the only way to make sense of the archives of Black freedom. It is a different way of bringing Blackness into history. It places slavery alongside empire and capitalism as forces against which champions of freedom must battle. If abolition is another word for communism, we might then even argue that the struggle for Black freedom is anterior to communism, its necessary prerequisite. These are the connections that help me see something other than despair and absence in the archives. They offer a way of writing Black history that does more than simply prove Africa and Africans do in fact have a history despite Hegel and Webster's objections. They instead gesture toward a Black philosophy of history that can account for both the enduring nature of slavery and the enormous gift of abolitionist thinking. Thank you.
Oh, Justin, that was amazing. Thank you so much for starting the conversation with that. I'm so grateful to have been invited to be here with people whose work I so admire. Yeah, I think this talk maybe connects to some of these questions in regard to absence in the historical. It concerns a piece that I've been working on for the past couple years, which I think also intersects with some of these questions on the archival. The colonial archive is implicitly insufficient, both in its substantiation of colonial violence and in its recording of the totality of that violence. The occlusion and withholding of the archive is its own form of violence, of course.
Would you use the mic, please? Yeah.
Sure. Can you hear it more now? The insufficiency of the archive as defined through colonial practice in both of these respects creates its interstices, as many scholars have described. The insufficiency of the colonial archive is an articulation of its limits, as well as that which is in excess of it. The acquisitive nature of the colonial archive is governed by accumulation. So how might we read the material that is left out or effectively evades the acquisitive logic of this archive? Perhaps we might counterpose the colonial formulation of the archival with other methods of recording and other forms of temporality. Specifically, the genealogical, which operates through a cyclic construction of time and renders the past as continually present. the impact of dominant constructions of time, maintained in part by the Colonial Archive, can be observed in the Discourse on Reparations. In Robert Wesley's 2005 text, The Accursed Share, The Problem of Value in Black Reparations Discourse, which offers a detailed analysis of Deidre Farmer Pailman's class action lawsuit pursuing corporate reparations, he writes, in Reparations Discourse, the construction of time and standing lends itself to two opposing cosmologies. One in which the passage of time decreases or eliminates standing to claim redress for race-based injuries, and the other in which its passage increases and compounds race-based injuries, and thus augments standing for redress. The former is the norm, whereas the latter is supported by proponents of reparations and is referred to as the accumulation or maturation thesis. These are not value-neutral positions. Their opposition speaks to the difference between viewing current race relations as radically distinct from the past and viewing those relations as coextensive with past practices. In other words, it is the difference between the past as bygone and the past as prologue. The conflict between these cosmologies of time and standing lies at the heart of whether any legal claim for slavery reparations will ever receive merit-based adjudication in the courts. My own interest in reparations stems in part from its deviance from and opposition to these legally and historically dominant constructions of time and property. In considering the origin of reparations claims, I've been looking to the ex-slavery settlement dictated by General Sherman's Field Order 15. Like many, I had understood that 40 acres and a mule had been promised to ex-slaves following the end of the Civil War, but was never granted. In fact, during 1865, approximately 40,000 ex-slaves were resettled on the basis of possessory title, with up to 40 acres per family, only to have these lands taken away by the Andrew Johnson administration in 1866. This is an approximate map of what became known as Sherman's Reservation. In keeping with the racialized and gendered definitions of property ownership, Field Order 15 granted possessory titles which did not offer the same rights as state-issued property titles and would only be assigned to the heads of families, effectively extending patriarchal systems of property ownership and imagining that the systematic separation of partners, parents, children, and extended relatives had not been central to the institution of slavery. I found it difficult to locate original copies of the possessory title documents. One of the only records of the ex-slavery settlement takes the form of the registers of land and occupants, which were created in 1866 to document and legitimate the repossession of the lands by the former Confederate owners. From left to right, the columns of the register read date, name of owner referring to the plantation owner, name of plantation, locality, number of acres, and on the right page first, the number of freed people living there. The following columns are demographic details about the freed population, if applicable. This register refers primarily to the Sea Islands. In my mind, the history of the field order constitutes a dual dispossession. Not only did the federal government grant these lands, resettle tens of thousands of former slaves, and then take the lands away, but it served to consolidate this large portion of the former slave population and force them into the sharecropping system en masse. Despite these facts, numerous acts of resistance were mounted through various methods, many of which appeared minor, but were effective enough to result in official complaints by the planters. One such complaint from a South Carolina planter in January of 1866 reads, "General, after the interview with which you favored me yesterday, it occurred to me that it would be proper that I should furnish you with a list of the Negroes whom I reported to you as having left their comfortable homes on my plantations in Orangeburg District with the intention of taking possession of my lands on Edisto and Wadmalaw Islands. They have all, the responsible ones I mean, resolutely refused to make any contracts for their labor, but are going down with their aged, their infirm, their diseased, and their children to squat upon my plantations on those islands and crowd me out of the possession of my property, by which I shall be prevented from employing other laborers to cultivate my lands. This they do contrary to my wishes frequently expressed and against my earnest warnings and prohibition. What can you do for me, General, to prevent this great injustice and wrong? Being now free, they have no claims upon me such as they formerly had, and if they be allowed to go down and settle upon my lands with all their encumbrances, it will greatly complicate the difficulties in restoring my lands to me, and give General Saxton and Captain Ketchum ground for postponing or perhaps entirely withholding from me the use of my property until they shall be able to find some other place for the disposal of those people. What will be the condition of myself and family in the meantime, and of other families in like condition with myself? We have no income, we are very destitute, and depend upon the cultivation of our lands for our support, and the return to our old homes for a place of shelter. How can this be done if our lands are permitted to be occupied by the Negroes who will not contract for work, nor work after they make contracts? The season is rapidly passing when we should be engaged in making preparations for the next crop, and a scarcity of food with all its horrors will soon be pressing upon our population. We feel the importance then of getting to work without delay, not only to obtain subsistence for our own families, but from another important consideration, that of giving employment to the freedmen by which they may entitle themselves to subsistence, a settled home, and reasonable wages, and thus prevent the multiplied evils which will spread over the country from vagrancy and starvation. I find this resistance to the regime of property remarkable. More than the granting of the land through the field order, it stands out to me because it does not comply with the contingent terms of allowance that first compelled a white-controlled government to grant the land for fear of uprising, and then caused this government to rescind it. This fear of uprising was longstanding in South Carolina, where for much of the 18th century and much of the 19th century, the slave population was far greater than the white population, and the low country of South Carolina had been grounded in a tradition of black resistance. In consideration of this tradition, I have been trying to think of how reparations might operate not through the individual or systemic authority of market-state relations, but might manifest as the relinquishment of value rather than the redistribution of it. The work I made in light of these considerations is titled Depreciation. It consists of 1 acre of land on Edisto Island and a restrictive covenant. My works always use a descriptive caption, which includes information that I consider part of the work. The caption for this piece reads, Depreciation 2018, Restrictive Covenant, 1 acre on Edisto Island, South Carolina. 40 acres and a mule, as reparations for slavery, originates in General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Orders number 15, issued on January 16th of 1865. Sherman's field order was issued out of concern for a potential uprising of the thousands of ex-slaves who were following his army by the time it arrived in Savannah. The field order stipulated that the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River in Florida are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground. This was followed by the formation of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in March of 1865. In the months immediately following the issue of the field orders, approximately 40,000 former slaves settled in the area designated by Sherman on the basis of possessory title. 10,000 of these former slaves were settled on Edisto Island, South Carolina. In 1866, following Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson effectively rescinded Field Order 15 by ordering these lands be returned to their previous Confederate owners. Former slaves were given the option to work for their former masters as sharecroppers or be evicted. If evicted, former slaves could be arrested for homelessness under vagrancy clauses of the Black Codes. Those who refused to leave and refused to sign sharecrop contracts were threatened with arrest. Although restoration of the land to previous Confederate owners was slowed in some cases by court challenges filed by ex-slaves, nearly all the land settled was returned by the 1870s. As Eric Foner writes, Johnson had in effect abrogated the Confiscation Act and unilaterally amended the law creating the Freedmen's Bureau. The idea of a Freedmen's Bureau actively promoting Black land ownership had come to an abrupt end. The Freedmen's Bureau agents became primary proponents of labor contracts, inducting former slaves into the sharecropping system. Among the lands that were repossessed in 1866 by former Confederate owners was the Maxi Place Plantation. As historian Charles Spencer writes, a group of freed people were at Maxi Place in January of 1866. The people contracted to work for the proprietor, but no contract or list of names has been found. The 1-acre piece of land at 8060 Maxi Road, Edisto Island, South Carolina, was part of the Maxi Place Plantation. This land was purchased at market value on August 6, 2018 by 8060 Maxi Road, Inc., a nonprofit company formed for the sole purpose of buying this land and recording a restrictive covenant on its use. This covenant has, as its explicit purpose, the restriction of all development and use of the property by the owner. The property is now appraised at $0. By rendering it legally unusable, this restrictive covenant eliminates the market value of the land. These restrictions run with the land regardless of the owner. As such, they will last indefinitely. As reparation, this covenant asks how land might exist outside of the legal economic regime of property that was instituted by slavery and colonization. Rather than redistributing property, the restriction imposed on 8060 Maxi Road status as valuable and transactable real estate asserts antagonism to the regime of property as a means of reparation. So this is what I call the component of the work intended for exhibition. This left frame contains the deed and the restrictions, so the top 4 pages are the deed. I can go back through it later, but just to, I'm a little short on time. And then these are the restrictions. It sort of begins with the definitions. Structure and use are sort of the crucial definitions in this. And then these are the restrictions and remedies themselves. The right frame contains the appraisal, which I ordered after the restrictions were recorded. This is what they call the reconciliation, which sort of the final reconciliation details that the appraiser estimates the market value as defined of the subject of the property as of August 25th to be $0, resulting directly from the restrictions. And these photos are taken and included as part of the appraisal. And, these maps are also included as part of the appraisal. So the road to the right is Maxi Road. And that's Edisto Island. Just for context, this is not a particularly good scan, but this is a map created by the Edisto Historical Society of the plantations on Edisto Island between 1851 and 1857. And these are the approximate boundaries of Maxi Place Plantation. My goal with this work is not to say that this land should never be used, but rather to ask that it should never be used within the terms of this legal economic system. I intentionally chose to use a legal instrument which has been most commonly used to increase the value of land owned by white people, to eliminate the value of this land. The Restrictive Covenant puts restrictions on how land is to be used by whoever owns it. So although the land is still able to be owned, the bundle of rights that ownership confers is extremely limited, so much so that it is actually worth nothing. In conceiving of reparations as an antagonism to property, perhaps it would constitute a necessary confrontation with a central principle of our legal and economic systems, one which has maintained the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, as well as indigenous genocide and numerous other genealogies of subjection. The violations of slavery and colonization live on in existing property and law. If the colonial archive is necessary to understanding the longevity of colonialism, then redress might operate through challenging the property-based acquisitive logic that governs it and that it maintains. I chose this acre of land because of the limited information I've gathered on its history, but I know that it contains legacies that far exceed what is recorded or what I've been able to access. So I hope for this work to in some way memorialize that absence and to act as a placeholder for that which has not been recorded. I would hope that the contestation of its preservation as property might allow for this land to be considered in terms of the cyclic and continual present of genealogical time. As an antagonism, it is inherently incomplete. However, the inability to fully repair is part of how we might understand reparations. The very definition of reparation might be better understood as an unending attempt rather than a complete resolution. Thank you.
Good afternoon, or is it still morning? I think so, morning. Thank you guys for having me. My name is Belle, and I'm very, very excited to be here. So my work begins with my positionality as a Virgin Islander and an artist that lives in a place that has been colonized 7 times, the longest being Denmark for over 250 years, and the last being the United States for just over 100. The colonial engagement with Denmark, spurred by their participation in the transatlantic slave trade, produced an immense archive. And in 1917, when we were transferred to the United States, the archives were splintered, where some went to the US, a little remained in the Virgin Islands, but most went to Denmark, including such things as our indigenous artifacts. So with a lack of access, both in distance and in language, we do not speak Danish, we are a community that has had to remember in other ways, through songs, traditions, architecture, and a large part of my practice follows in this tradition of the production of memory and knowledge. I investigate various types of archives, or what I call the materiality of coloniality, challenging them their hierarchies, their silences, and in doing so, my work is not centered in one medium, but begins first with this investigative process and results in various forms, among them photography, painting, sculpture, video, installation, ceramics, public art. So today I'd like to share with you a selection from my practice, and I'll begin with my work that deals with Cheney. So Cheney is a hybrid word. It means China and money, and it's a word that we use to describe these fragments of colonial pottery that we find all over the Virgin Islands, but especially in St. Croix, where we were cut up in almost 150 plantations. And a lot of these fragments keep resurfacing after a hard rain. They were called money because children used to use them, round them, and use them in games. But most currently, the use is we use them for jewelry. On my very first trip to Denmark in 2008, I got very attracted to this store. I wandered in, and a lot of what I was doing there was researching the connections between Denmark and the Virgin Islands, and I was thinking that maybe Denmark had the same level of visual impact and remnants that we did. They did not. But this store caught my eye, and partly because I realized when I was in that store, it was the first time I had ever seen one of these colonial plates intact. I had asked there was a museum at the top of the store, and I had figured, since this company was started a little over 240 years ago, that during the time where we were a colony, that there would be some plates, and there were. That interaction was very interesting. Because I was denied access to the plates, but I was able to find some things on the internet. And there were a series of plates that did deal with the Virgin Islands in various ways. I titled this piece Collectible for many reasons, but the relationship between Denmark and the Virgin Islands has definitely been one. I mean, what do you do with paper plates? You use them and you dispose of them when you're finished. And so by transferring the material from this very prized porcelain to representing some of the colonial archives in the paper plates, I felt I was able to comment on that. This work also led me to a series of paintings where I take various fragments and I piece them together into large paintings. This is a series I started in 2015, and for me, I definitely see them as process paintings, meaning that when I take a look at the fragments, I don't necessarily know. I mean, if you look at the paintings, what you're able to see is that some of the flowers, they look very strange. There's kind of I have to use my imagination for what I don't know. And I think that is a very important challenge to colonialism, the use of one's imagination to kind of think about the ways that we can reconstruct our identities. For example, if we don't have our full, complete African identity or European identities or indigenous identities, but we can create something new, and I feel that this is the process that I'm trying to represent in these paintings. I've also done them, you can see that also with installations, where you can see the Cheney in the ground. And the centennial year, meaning the 100 years that we were sold and transferred from Denmark to the United States. That commemoration just happened a few years ago, 2 years ago. And during that year, I was able to work at the Royal Copenhagen, which is one of the same store that I had wandered into almost 10 years prior. And I did a commissioned work there and another project, but for the first time, I understood my role as an artist by being in that factory as a disruptor into their history in some ways. It's a very white institution with white porcelain and white people, and I was the only black artist in their 200 and something year history that they'd ever worked with. And what I found interesting is taking these patterns that were not just Danish, but Dutch and German and English, and kind of literally being a disruptor into their factory system. These are some of the plates that I produced there. I also have looked into some of the other ceramic history. This one is called, this project was called In Service to a Kingdom, but this These are a series of plates that were commissioned in the 1830s by the King of Denmark. And very quickly, I think a lot of people think about Denmark as a very small country, and it was. It is today, but back then it included Sweden, parts of Germany, Greenland, so it was a much more vast kingdom. So these plates represent that, and there was one plate that represented the Virgin Islands, and this is a bay in St. Thomas. But what I found interesting, I had thought, well, I think I'll do something similar to what I did with the collectible series. I'll reproduce this plate on a paper plate. That didn't work. But I decided instead to reproduce it across many plates. And I thought this was an interesting strategy because it kind of highlighted again on the fragmentation and how we're often imagined in the colonial archives, where there are all these spaces, and there's a fluidity also in the image, which I learned, of course, trying to install it. It will never be installed the same way as the piece travels. I think I went backwards. Where did I go? Okay. I also have, of course, in terms of how we think of archives, in terms of photographs, a lot of these images, most Virgin Islanders have never seen. They're kept in the archives in Denmark, although there was an initiative in 2017 to digitize over 1 million of these documents. But for me, the very first time engaging with them was really significant. There were some images that permanently seared in my brain, like this one of these women with the Danish prince is here on the top, and then these military officers, they're holding one of the women's breasts, which was very unusual. There was another image for me that also stood out, which was of this young child that, without their parents, that was screaming, and this was a postcard that was circulated during the time. And this is in the context of a photo album, where people would have kept this album, and as you're going through it, this is another image that you would encounter. Years later, when I was going through my own personal archives, I realized that I had a similar image. I remembered it because I never forgot the previous one. And when I saw this one, I thought that there was something interesting that was being commented on, at least first in the composition, and then also in the narrative. So the postcard was titled A St. Croix Picnic, Danish West Indies, and what I decided to do was to do a series of juxtapositions. So I named, using the same language, the image of myself, St. Croix Picnic, USVI, to comment on the linkages with our colonial past, but there's also, I think, an ambiguity in my image, where it's difficult to see if I'm crying or I'm smiling. So I was able to expand that series in juxtaposing some of my own personal archives with the ones that were in Denmark. Some of them include the one on the top left is my mother with my brother. And what I thought was very interesting about these images is the markers of social mobility. The label in the archive that this picture on the left has is a woman with child of upper class, which is something that we don't necessarily think about in terms of the Black community in the Caribbean. We think about class structures maybe as a more recent phenomenon, but it was interesting to me to look at an image from the 1800s that was commenting on class in that way. And you see some of the signifiers very similarly in my mother's presentation of herself in front of a house, a concrete house, on a hill. All those things also have signifiers of class. She has her hair straightened. She's probably the first generation that's wearing store-bought clothes, etc. The image on the bottom left is of my father and Obiaman, which is a word in the Caribbean that's used to describe people who practice African religious traditions. It's somewhat, depending, could be a pejorative word. But I thought what was interesting, again, is how these images makes you think about the person who's taking the picture, the narratives that are in them, and I guess more of fluidity because, there are many different things in terms of taking the color out of the images, and some of them are more recent than others that I wanted to highlight in this series. Thanks. Okay. So this work, I think there's something missing. Yeah. Okay. This work is called Errata, and it's a piece that I wanted, well, it came out of a violation, actually, that occurred for myself. My studio in the Virgin Islands is in a building from the 1700s, and it was part of the free color community, none of which I knew when I bought the building. And I've done another project about that, but I had a Danish architect who included me in her book as a way to talk about people who were working with some of the vernacular architecture. I learned shortly after the book came out that there were some mistakes in what she did with my story. She said that I inherited the property from my family, which was not true. And then she also said that I was related to the women from the 1700s who owned and lived in this building. That was a little shocking to me, and it may seem like innocuous mistakes, but they're not. One, because the buildings had drug addicts living in them. So in some ways, she was stating that my parents gave me as my inheritance a building that was derelict, which was not true. And in addition to that, it revealed this beautiful but very incorrect narrative of this idea that I could be related to the women in the 1700s, and there was a direct lineage from the home ownership, which is crazy if you understand Caribbean history. So she gave me, we started a series of emails where hey, I heard your book came out, great, but could you, someone brought it to my attention, there may be some mistakes. And this engagement of us writing back and forth, the second email, she's like, oh yeah, I'm on holiday, but I think, maybe I got some things wrong, and I was just like, what? So we engaged in over about 6 months, a series of emails back and forth. Somewhere in there, she gives me an apology, but I really was like, no. How did you come to write these things about me? Because I didn't tell you these things. So it was a very frustrating experience, but I realized that art had the power to kind of penetrate, almost like a rock, paper, scissors, like it had the power to penetrate this authoritative stance of a book. And so what I did was I did a piece where I juxtaposed her book with the emails that we had over the last 6 months. The curators were a little concerned about the ethics of that. But I was able to convince them that, this was not a personal vendetta, that I was trying to highlight, when we look at archives, what we're looking at are people's personal letters and interactions, and I wanted them to see that the same silences and the same ways that we had been treated in the archive, it was happening again, but in 2017. And it was happening to me. So, so yes, this work is called Errata. If you want to read it, it's on my website, the entire piece. And this work also, as I mentioned, a lot of our archives are in the form of our buildings. In St. Croix, we have 2 beautiful historic towns. Most of them were built by the hands of enslaved Africans, and this is an example. This wall is quite unique because you see on the one hand coral stones that were taken out of the ocean by the enslaved. The coral also gets burnt and becomes the binding of a lot of the buildings. And then on the other side, you see the Danish brick that's being imported. And so what I started doing was a series that's called Wall Rubbings. It's Wall Rubbings, a record of the work of others, and it's kind of reproducing some of these walls and highlighting the labor of this invisibilized labor. This also led, well, actually, this is a previous piece, but, where my studio is, sometimes I would sit outside and I would find these coral stones. So this is the first gesture that got me thinking about, why are these coral stones even here? Why are they in the ocean? But that they really had the mark of these, the enslaved. And so this piece is called Trading Posts, which is a sculpture that takes the work and kind of inverts the way that you normally think about sculpture, where the posts or the plinth is what supports what you're going to talk about, but it really kind of highlights the foundation of our towns, of the colonial wealth, etc. This is a little example of a building in the town of Frederiksted, which is our western town. We have two. And this town is unique because it was burnt down in 1878. And so when it was rebuilt, this type of gingerbread fretwork was very popular during that time. And what I thought was interesting is how the town had a marker of its history. So in addition to that, when we're thinking about resistance, you know, the two most used forms of resistance by the enslaved and the colonized were cutting and burning, which were first colonial tools. When you came to a quote-unquote virgin landscape, the first thing you did if you wanted to tame it to a plantation is you cut it down and then you burn it down. And then those are also the tools in the, you know, very much in the colonial project as well. But then people use them and transform them as tools of resistance. And I wanted to try to develop a visuality around that. So this work is done by taking a woodworking tool. So again, taking a tool that's not quite, you know, cranking it up and being able to cut and burn into paper at the same time. And for me, I very much see them as a form of, you know, another archive kind of documenting not only the tools of resistance, but what's beautiful about art is sometimes when you show it, people reflect other things onto you. So the first time I showed this work, someone came up to me and put their hand on my shoulder and was like, are you okay? And I kind of, at first I was a little like, you know, what? And then I realized, because they said, you know, there's so much pain in this work. And, you know, of course we know that if people are going through psychological trauma, they also, you know, there's this tendency to cut or make burns onto their skin. So for me, I thought that was an amazing aspect that the work was able to capture, like what I thought in terms of my intellectual framing of tools of resistance, but that it also had this aspect of psychological trauma. And so it's taken various forms in terms of panels that use the fretwork designs, some other types of installation work, and I will end with that project.
This has been a wonderful panel, and there are great echoes across the presentations. So I don't know if you want to speak to one another. So yes, I guess one thing that was immediately apparent to me between Cameron and Vaughn is these kind of like imaginative strategies for both announcing the violence that's in the archive, but then responding to that with these kind of creative making. So I don't know, talking about the practice in that way, and then with Justin and Cameron, I mean, abolition as communism. Yes, you know, the most kind of fundamental way of attacking property as an institution, as it's lived deeply, as it's embodied, as it's in flesh, and then that beautiful, perverse redeployment and undoing of the restrictive covenant. So maybe we can start out there and then open it up for questions.
Well, I'll start with something easy and just say I really, one of the things that you said about the Danish archives being removed and bringing into the equation this question of accessibility was really fascinating to me, because access is a part of our relationship to archives that we don't often think about, but it's pretty profound. I was just reminded by a colleague the other day that Angela Davis's foundational essay on the role of women in enslaved communities, she wrote it while she was incarcerated. And so the kind of subsequent engagements and critiques about whether or not her kind of framework was correct or sort of asking the wrong questions. It was sort of what, how, and why was she producing this without access to archives that would have changed maybe the way she laid out facts, or you know, I live in San Francisco, and down the street from me, this the Center for Sex and Culture, which is basically a kink archive and, you know, workshop and community space, is shutting down because of rent increases. And a big part of the archive is going to Harvard, which is great because it's being preserved, but is also maybe not the place for a community archive, particularly, you know, for all sorts of reasons. And so I mean, I think that that aspect of the work was one of many fascinating ones.
Thank you. I think for me, you know, the archives from the Danish colonial period, in one way people talk about them as being extremely intact. In the Virgin Islands, there are many people who are ancestral Virgin Islands who can trace their lineage all the way back, and part of it is because of the fact that the Danes outsourced their colonialism, which is why we don't always often associate them with being colonizers, because they brought in men from Scotland and Ireland and England to actually run the plantations. But access has been a huge issue, but in addition, you know, what we see in terms of the current engagement, and in terms of how Virgin Islanders' lens will have something really unique and different. And there's so many things that in my engagement with the archives, I realized that I'm one of the first in over, I mean, probably since they've been created, to see things, and we will ask very different questions of the archives. And so in terms of what kind of knowledge is being produced, I'll give you just a quick example. I had been very interested in the ledgers that kind of talk about, one of the things that people were traded for was cloth. And you know, we have this tradition of wearing madras in many parts of the Caribbean, but in the Virgin Islands, it's used as a symbol of identity. And various forms of madras were the things that were being used to trade people. And you can see where they would say this amount of cloth for this amount of people. And when I had gone to the archivist, because it's hard for me to access it not speaking Gothic Danish or writing it, I would say, so is there anything else in there that maybe deals with cloth? And he said, well, there's this one thing about a rebel head tie, you know, that a lot of women had been, and the way he said it was so flippant, you know, and I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he said, apparently the women that were in one of the major revolts, they had a way that they would wrap their hair that signaled that they were part of the resistance. And so a lot of times in the court documents, in the court trials, they're being asked about that. And it was, for me, it was so it was exhilarating and heartbreaking, because it was like, who would we be if we had known that? Because of course we still wrap our hair, and maybe there are ways that we're doing it that align with this, but we don't know. And I asked him, I said, has anyone written about this? He's like, no one would ever see that. I mean, how would, and you know, and also being the fact that it's mostly white Danish men that are accessing the archives, why would that be something that would jump out to them? So it's been an interesting process for me as an artist, also conceiving of, you know, as you guys talk about the failures in some ways of the way that the archives are constructed, as seeing my practice as another way of creating new archives that maybe are operating with different value systems. Yeah. And that's what I found really fascinating about your work. I just was like, wow.
Yeah, I guess is that right? Yeah, I mean, I guess this is sort of a question for both or all three of you, but just I was thinking about it in particular while you were speaking, Jess, and just, you know, I very much believe and I think in alignment with your formulation of the afterlife as something that interrupts the, you know, linearity of historical time. And my sort of question is, how does that then render the sort of the possibility or even primacy of history and historicity, and then also what does it do, you know, in the institutional context, right, where there are, I mean, that was sort of one of the things that I was trying to think about a little bit in regard to this question of the archive, right, because it's not just what's in and what's out, right, but as you mentioned, it's the methodology, and it's the temporal linearity, but it's also this sort of desire to accumulate. And there are so many aspects of the archive as an institution or as a substantiation of the institution that are sort of rooted in those accumulative agendas that are, I think, you know, really questioned by this question of the afterlife, right, or the specter of the afterlife. And you know, I mean, Saidiya talks about it a lot, but I'm, you know, I think that's, you know, one of the things I feel, you know, kinship with you, Vaughn, about is just, you know, how what are those possibilities? And I think that, you know, maybe there are certain ways of offering an idea for a possibility in art, but of course art is still governed by many of these same inquisitive logics. So I don't know if any of you have further thoughts on that, but it was something I was thinking about a lot and feel connected to both of you about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most striking part of your work, and I'm sure to me and to much of the audience, is the fact that you just enacted this total transformation in a way that, you know, anyone in theory in the past 150 years could have done, but it took this enormous imaginative leap to actually do it. And I think that, you know, I'm not an artist, but as a sort of person who works in a university, I would call that a type of reading practice. And I think so much of what all of us have been talking about is not simply about is something there or is it not there. It's what you do to whatever you find. And I think for me, in terms of thinking about the works that are most influential to me, I think there's really been this feminist reading practice that informs so much of all of this type of work. You know, when I was in graduate school, I worked with Jennifer Morgan, who's a scholar of gender and slavery. And if you've ever heard her speak, she often begins a conversation with a story about how she is introduced as the person who wrote that book with no evidence, or the various ways that people over the years continue to be dismissive of someone whose work has shaped an entire field. And I think, you know, you look at the kind of work that enacts these transformations on archives. I think the ones that bring kind of all of the lessons of feminist scholarship, from reading against the grain to focusing on the everyday and the quotidian, and it goes on, is always more successful than the type of work that tries to do that, but without the same kind of architecture or kind of background informing what it does. I mean, there's a chapter in Ed Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told that is just this, you understand what he's trying to do, kind of relating the plantation to sexual violence against enslaved women, but it's just horrible to read. And it's, you know, it's because he's not bringing that body of feminist scholarship to bear on the act of transformation on this archival material. So I think that's sort of an important framework for how this kind of thing is successful across mediums.
I think in some ways, visual arts has the ability to kind of break that linearity, because so much about what visual arts is kind of creating metaphors that have multiple points of entry and these different types of connections. And so I think it's a really interesting methodology to then apply to something like an archive. Yeah.
But it's also, what's interesting is that when I think of, like, you know, the best and most creative historians and thinkers in the tradition, I mean, they have a method of approach to archival material that's incredibly creative, like Edward Glissant's deconstruction of the Proclamation of Emancipation, right? Where there's a kind of poetics that exposes that possessive logic and the limited conception of freedom, or just the kind of interpretive wildness and really kind of a certain kind of recklessness of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. I mean, it's the force of an imaginative project that enables these other stories to you know, come into view. And I just want to talk to the panel for the next 2 hours, but I won't. I will not. So I think we should probably open it up for questions.
I also am very interested in what you said about the plantation and how it was set up where it was no longer worth anything and no one could plant. So having freed slaves have land meant absolutely nothing because they couldn't do anything for their families. So my question is, how'd you feel about that when you found that out? Because it made me think of the redlining, how they created districts where black people could live, but they couldn't afford to live and they couldn't really advance themselves. And then with the 14th Amendment, they also were trying to continue to enact Jim Crow laws and black codes, even though we were supposed to be beyond that. So how did you feel when you found this out? And I feel very enraged by this, but I was just wondering, how much further you're going to take this information, and can I look at it?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of things there. One of the reasons I was so interested in this, sort of the particulars of the field order and this sort of event or non-event that was almost immediately reversed is because it did actually occur. And I think that there's a sort of common misconception that it never occurred. And that is part of our general understanding that reparations are politically, economically, and socially impossible. And, in sort of longer formats, sometimes I like to remember that, all emancipation in the United Kingdom was compensated, right? And so the slave owners were actually paid for their loss of property. And so the idea that no one could have been repaid is obviously contravened by this fact that the slave owners were paid. This was actually something that was promoted by Lincoln during the Civil War in 1862 as a way of trying to quell the conflict, and was only adopted in one state, which was Washington, D.C., where all of the slave owners were compensated for up to $300 per slave. So in light of those histories, the fact that, the field order was passed and this resettlement occurred on these highly contingent terms, it was extremely enraging, but also I would say deeply significant. Significant in, I think, two different ways. Significant in the fact that it, sort of stakes out this, the terms for land use that were to follow it, as you mentioned, with regard to redlining in Jim Crow, and it also stakes out the complications resulting from these highly contingent definitions of property. And so, in a certain way, it's not surprising, right? Because at this moment where the definition of the slave and the former slave were in such close proximity to the definition of property itself, the idea that they would be suddenly granted full rights of ownership is, I think, perhaps impossible. And one of the things that is really interesting in the history of Edisto and the Sea Islands is just that many sharecroppers worked hard to sort of acquire land. Many of the lands that they bought were not conferred with a full title, even in the late 1800s or late 1900s or early, late 1800s or early 1900s. And what this has created is this category that they call in the Sea Islands heirs property, which is basically property that has been inherited to the descendants of sharecroppers without their knowledge, either because titles weren't transferred or because the titles were so-called lost. And many of those pieces of property are now being auctioned at tax auctions because they have tax liens on them, because the taxes haven't been paid, because people don't know that they own them. Yes.
One of the things that you said that I thought was great was thinking about redress, not as the redistribution of value, but as the emptying of the value form. And I think that's really important in terms of thinking about the connection between what seems like historical and our present, because maybe, you know, that's actually the way to think about building an alternative to racial capitalism, because it's an investment in those value forms that keep people, you know, possessively invested in whiteness, and the kind of the devaluation of blackness is so foundational, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has shown in her new work, that even before redlining black sociality, its kind of failure to produce normative gender categories, its sexual excesses overdetermines black valuelessness, right? So what might it mean to embrace a kind of destitution, and what might it produce?
I want to thank all of you for your research. It's really great, especially the reparations piece. That was kind of interesting too, and also, I think your name is the guy who talked about. Hold on. You mentioned the black press, the black newspapers, and recently I've been working on an article about the Associated Negro Press, and so much of that history is missing also, and what the press really did. And I'm just finding out that history myself. And I think it's something that we all need to look into. And then also you mentioned that a lot of the violence has not been properly documented. And this year is the anniversary of the Red Summer of 1919. So I've been doing some research on that. And just recently have people written about the extent of the violence. So much has been left out to protect the overseers, the colonializers, and then also the role that the government has played. In fact, I don't think we've had any government that has really done what they're supposed to do or addressed the issues of African Americans. So we're still confronted with that. And thank all of you for your work.
Digital humanities is like so extremely important right now, and making these materials accessible to all, like the way that I guess most people conceptualize it, that would be the not easiest, but the most accessible to everyone, making it open source and having these things be available regardless of where you're on the planet, blah, blah, blah. But as we've seen in many of these platforms where like users are cultivating the content there, your YouTubes, your Twitters, your Tumblrs, the users are like making the experience of what the actual site is, and in many of these cases, because the infrastructure is not bearing out it doesn't have like an analysis of like race, class, gender, it's just replicating the same sort of market forces over and over again. So I guess the trouble with open source modes is that if not made with this in mind, it'll just replicate the same sort of violences that are in the archival work that you're trying to preserve. So are there any, I guess, historical instances that you have in mind of people kind of making that sort of horizontal, almost like a gardener tending to a garden sort of structure with this archival material, or with this material that could help inform how we would do this today without just having something like a YouTube where it doesn't matter if what video you're watching, the recommendations may be like Nazi propaganda.
Well, I'll sort of say two not very profound things in two parts. I use a lot of video when I teach, and so scouring YouTube, I never had any idea how much like Nazi propaganda, but also just bad stuff is on there, and it's actually really like that model of open access. Even if there wasn't the question of the ability to take down videos or sort of limit people's access to them at a whim, the totally unmediated search result is not necessarily a useful one. And I also think that we all sort of talk on and on about criticizing the way archives work, but as you suggested in discussing the Black press, they actually, I mean, there is a value to going through what is there and drawing stuff out of it. I'm in the process of reviewing these grant applications for the National Archives where people are producing, they're basically publishing as edited collections, books of documents, and it's kind of a really incredible process. One of the projects is the Frederick Douglass Papers. One of the projects is the Freedom, a documentary history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. People have put decades into their lives to produce this, and I think as you think about how to arrange material you get from many different archives, you can do it in an accessible way. There's another project on the papers of Emerson that's sort of was conceived as a digital archive and written in, I don't know anything about coding, but sort of written in such a way that technological change won't kind of make previous code valueless. And I mean, I think there's interesting ways of making archives accessible, but sort of saying all modes of categorizing knowledge are bad is, is maybe not a productive starting place, right? It's about making what is out there easier to access for the most number of people.
I mean, some of my thoughts in thinking about what you were saying is just in the work that I've been doing with the archives and the fact that these are some of the questions that have been asked about the Danish colonial archives as they're making them all available online. Are there certain images that should not be on there? Because, I'll just even, I took my children with me for when I was doing a residency. I was there for 3 months, and they're definitely, I have girls, there's definitely certain images I would not want them to see because it would dramatically alter the way that they saw themselves. And there's lots of those images in the archives. And I think, so those are some of the questions about digitization and some of the, how, I don't know if I would use the word censorship, but how, these are the questions of ethics around it that I think are, I don't know if I have the answers to them, but I do know that some archives are now kind of constructing certain permissions, there's certain, especially in the Virgin Islands where there are descendants of people who are on these, they're trying to ask these types of questions. Should we contact family members? Should there be, how they're not just, faceless and nameless. They have relatives. What does that mean to just put their images out there? I don't know. I think there's more questions than we have answers at this point, but maybe some of you guys have some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I was just thinking of, which is about also an embodied, one thing I was thinking of in responding to you is just that, the embodied inhabitation of the archive. Most historians wouldn't think of the power of the archive to injure you, right? So it's so that says something about the life and force of what's contained there and how it reverberates with the present and is still structuring it.
Yeah.
So should we have a last question? And then maybe I've said it and then that's it.
I have just one small question for Cameron. I joined the presentation with your discussion of sharecropping, and I'm just wondering, in your data mining of archival properties, were you able to find a connection between the sharecroppers in the South, the owners of the companies, companies that brought the cotton from the South to the Northeast, like Massachusetts, that put them on the ships and sent it to British and to China? Did you see a connection beginning off of sharecroppers with international trade that may be a precursor to global economics? I'm the daughter of a sharecropper, granddaughter.
I have a feeling that other people on the panel might have a better answer to this question. But I guess my inadequate answer is that I don't have so much information specifically about the relationship between the sharecropping economy and trade any more than the trade routes that were established as part of the plantations were participant to these routes of global trade that were, of course, part of the triangulation, right? One of the things that in other work I've kind of thought a lot about is during the period immediately following the Civil War, the advent of the convict lease system, and how, in the South, as part of the war, the Union had strategically destroyed transportation infrastructure, primarily the railroads that existed. And a big part of economic reconstruction in the South was the rebuilding of railroads. This began with convict lease labor and the shipping of coal and iron from the north, where the largest mines were in Pittsburgh, was exorbitantly expensive, and so this facilitated the realization that there were massive coal seams in the South, which hadn't really been tapped before the Civil War, primarily in Chattanooga, Birmingham, and Atlanta. And so Birmingham was created in 1871 in the image of Birmingham in the UK as this industrial center surrounded by a coal field. And in using convict lease labor, which was fully fungible and expendable in ways that the property interest of the slave was not, the convict lease workers were sent into coal mines, which were extremely hazardous because they had very rudimentary technology for mining in the South, often died, and were replaced with other convict lease workers at no expense to the operator by the state. In doing this, the South, greatly expanded their capacity for industrial production and transportation, and built this massive system that became Southern Railway that connected the hubs of Chattanooga, Birmingham, and Atlanta, and is part of the urban development in those places the way it is. So those routes were used for international trade, but they were also used for domestic trade of coal, and actually still exist and transport coal. But I don't know if somebody has a more specific information about the legacy of sharecroppers in regard to trade.
I don't, but I did want to ask a question of you guys, because I think before we end, and I would like, and I'm sure maybe the audience might find something useful as we're thinking about dealing with archives. I think I'm really, because I opened my talk talking about my own positionality, because I think it speaks to like where are your coordinates, and what you're trying to glean from the archives talks a lot about what archives can do. And I was really curious about both of you, like what about your positionality got you engaged in the type of work that you're doing, and so that we can understand a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm from Boston originally, and it's a place where Black people have been free for more than 2 centuries, and there have been all different kinds of Black people, educated, rich, for much of that time. But if you think about the kind of the most vulnerable, the forces that they are vulnerable to haven't changed much over 2 centuries. It's a very different type of change than, convict leasing or the endurance of slavery in the South. And so I think that coming from a place like that, made me predisposed to really being more concerned with what stays the same rather than what changes in some momentous moment.
I guess I've sort of come to this work through some linked interests. Part of it in trying to develop, what I think of as like a materialist analysis within art that both refers to the sort of practice of historical materialism, but also acknowledges the limitations that Black Marxist scholars have drawn out, and also tries to make space for the ways that archival practices and academic scholarship have certain built-in parameters that the sort of immediacy of material within art practice might be able to supplement. And so I think I really come to making art as a way of trying to work in service of other forms of Black study.
Maybe we should end on that wonderful note.